Okay, well, why don't we kick off? Let me just introduce the session. Welcome, everybody. Great to have a good turnout tonight. And we're talking about the Wabakimi area, including the Caribou Monitoring Project. So before we dive in with our two presenters, I'll just welcome everybody on behalf of the Wilderness Canoe Association. I'm Tom Connell. I'm on the board, and I'm also on our conservation committee. And this is the connection with the Wabakimi representatives is really a part of our effort to feature different organizations who are doing good things in the area of conservation. So this is an excellent topic. Gary Adaman, who's the head of the WCA, is also on. I think we've invited people from ORCA, Ontario Recreational Canoe and Kayak Association, and maybe a couple of regional canoe clubs. So welcome to anybody who hasn't been to WCA events in the past. It's great that you could join us, and welcome to WCA members from here and near and far. So this session is being recorded. We're going to hear from the presenters. I'm not sure how long that'll be, 45 minutes maybe, give or take a bit. Maybe if people put questions as we go in the chat, and we can, to the extent they're particularly context sensitive, we can try to pick them up as we go. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for Q&A and discussion. So let me introduce our two presenters. We have Vern Fish joining us from Waterloo, Iowa. Vern is the president of the Friends of Wabakimi and has a distinguished career in various conservation activities such as the Black Hawk County Conservation Board, Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation Board, Black Hawk Soil and Water Conservation District, and is an avid paddler. And we're also delighted to have Kate Prince, who is the project manager for the Wabakimi Boreal Caribou Citizen Monitoring Project. And Kate is actively involved in environmental stewardship, coupled with her enthusiasm for paddling in wild places. So it sounds like the ideal person to be talking about the Caribou Monitoring Project. It's particularly nice to see a tag team, a cross-border tag team. The news this week has been a bit unsettling, but I think the fundamentals is great passion for paddling on both sides of the border and wonderful relationships, and we very much sort of endorse that as far as the WCA is concerned, since we have members in, I think, 29 states and across Canada and a few other places. So it's great for Vern and anybody else from the US who's joining us tonight. So having said that, Vern, I think you're up first. Can I hand it over to you?
Yes. And again, thank the Friends of Wabakimi. Really appreciate the Wilderness Canoe Association letting us partner and tell this story. And again, thank you for those kind comments. See if I can. As you've already pointed out, my background is in resource management in the state of Iowa, but I've also been very fortunate to spend a lot of time north of the border. So I think I can speak to the local issues, but also one of the beauties of working with Wabakimi is being able to work on international issues. So, that is my background. Part of the reason, these are two guys that I paddle with over the years, and this is the Green Mantle River, which is on the Wabakimi River. And one of the reasons I paddle, and I think this fits a lot of the people in this group, is a very short little poem here. There's a magic in the feel of the paddle, the movement of the canoe, magic compounded by distance, adventure, solitude, and peace by Sigurd Olsen. And that kind of drives my love of the paddling world. And Wabakimi makes that really happen because you've really got the distance, solitude, and peace in that large area. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit. Wabakimi means whitewater, sheet of white. It's also part of the reason it was created is to protect woodland caribou, and that is one of the charismatic megafauna that makes the park what it is. Just to give you a sense here, here's Wabakimi, here's the Boundary Waters, there's Quetico, woodland caribou, And I throw in Polar Bear Provincial Park because, as many of you know, that is the largest provincial park in Ontario, and it gives us a reference for Wabakimi. Thunder Bay is right there. The gateway to Wabakimi is Armstrong, which is actually a railroad access point. That's one of the ways you can get there by road or by railroad. But that is one of the few access points for the park. There really isn't a lot of, other than the railroad, there isn't a lot of road access to the huge area. So I always kind of like to throw this in because I think this is kind of entertaining for me. There's Thunder Bay. There's Armstrong, and Wabakimi is 3 hours north of Thunder Bay. It is 17 and a half hours west of Waterloo, Ontario, and as we talked earlier, that's sort of a sister city. Wabakimi is 10 and a half hours east of Winnipeg, and then where I'm at in Waterloo, Iowa, it's a 12-hour trip. So I always find it ironic that it's closer for us folks in the upper Midwest than it is for the folks in Southern Ontario. And that's part of the reason that there's so many upper Midwesterners involved in the Friends of Wabakimi, because it's relatively close. It's a long way for most Southern Ontario, for folks in Southern Ontario. The park, as the reason I pointed out Polar Bear is Wabakimi is the second largest provincial park in the Ontario system. Polar Bear is number one. It was created in '83, and in '97 it was expanded sixfold. It protects cultural and natural resources and prime woodland caribou habitat. And Kate will go into a lot more detail about that, but there's maybe 400 or 500 caribou in the park. And as I understand it, there's only 5,000 or so caribou across the province. So it really is a major area of protection. Minnesota likes to talk about 10,000 lakes. Well, Wabakimi has that many in the park itself. World-class canoeing opportunity, couple thousand kilometers of trails. The number kind of varies, but it's definitely less than 700 paddlers a year. Some years it's less than 400 or 500 paddlers. You have probably a better chance of seeing a caribou than you see another paddler. It's surrounded by Crown land and portions of 5 forest management units. And the Crown land provides access to 6 other provincial parks and 3 conservation reserves. And those are a list of it. So that's why we refer to it as the Wabakimi area. We include the Crown land and those surrounding other protected areas as part of and the park. So it's more than just the park, it's the whole area. And 10,000 square miles, big enough to swallow the state of Vermont or Prince Edward Island 5 times. It is an absolutely huge wilderness area, and for most people, it will take a lifetime to see it all. Again, to kind of point that out, there's the Albany, the white areas of Crown land, there's the Bright Sands, the Kopka, there's Gull River, White Sands, Mojet Conservation Reserve, and then the Atwood. So it kind of gives you a sense of the area. Lake Nibbicon is right there to the south and to the east. The Wabakimi project was ran from 2004 to 2018. It was an effort to clear existing routes within the park and quickly was expanded to link canoe routes across Crown lands to the adjacent provincial parks and conservation reserves. Phil Cotton was the driving force, avid canoe historian, a Thunder Bay music teacher. And if you've ever run into a music teacher, you know they're used to directing traffic. He was really good at directing traffic and telling people what to do and how to do it. He founded the Wabakimi Project in 2004, and he ran it until 2018 when he passed. Over 244 people were involved from North America and Europe. Over 153 trips went into the Wabakimi area. The numbers are impressive. Identified 10,000 or 1,000 campsites, 1,000 portages, made a real difference in the area. So that's what was the driving force behind this. But what Phil realized that when he knew that at some point he was going to have to hand this off. And so what he did was he created the Friends of Wabakimi in 2014 to carry on this legacy. And it's a nonprofit that is incorporated in the province of Ontario. And so the project morphed into the Friends of Wabakimi, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like now. We just recently did a strategic planning session in Thunder Bay this September. And so we've done a lot of updating on this, but as noted, the Friends of Wabakimi was created to carry on the work of the project. I've already kind of defined the Wabakimi area. Again, it's a huge area. It's the size of the state of Vermont. And there again is the map for it. We also put together a land acknowledgement, and I'm not going to read it word for word, but basically we recognized that there were people in the Wabakimi area a long time ago. The territory is covered by Treaty 3, Treaty 9, and the Robinson Superior Treaty, and we respectfully acknowledge that those indigenous communities have played a role in managing these lands, and we're committed to learn about the history and to take action to move towards meaningful reconciliation. So we've got a long way to go on that, but at least we're trying to make an effort to recognize that there's a lot of history there before we showed up. As noted, our vision is to the Wabakimi area to be a premier wilderness area for current and future generations. And our mission is to protect provide protection, sustainable economic development, and preserve the diverse cultural, natural, and recreational resources of the area. Kate's going to go into a lot more detail on that, and we hope to do that through volunteer engagement and partnerships. And we've got a whole set of objectives, and I'm going to rattle through, not really specifically all of them, but I think the one that's important is to advocate and actively campaign for the preservation and protection of this unique natural area. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of some of the examples of things that we've done. Raising money is one of those. We've worked closely with the park staff. In 2020, we raised over almost $8,000 to do a debris removal project. You can see some of the work. In 2021, we raised over $8,000 to help build a new Armstrong, or a kiosk in Armstrong, to recognize that the park is actually there. We worked with an indigenous artist, Kevin Balmore. This is his work. He called it Wabakimi, and we actually make that available for sale. And then that money goes to the Casey Lodge, which is part of one of the local high schools in Thunder Bay, to provide a product and stuff that will help indigenous students with their studies. And so we're very proud to be raising money for that project. We've been involved with the Ontario Breeding Atlas Project. We raised money for song meters that went into the park. And then recently, we also did a debris removal on Lake Shabasquea, raised a chunk of money. And the big part of that is the park doesn't have a plane. And so we're raising money so they can fly stuff out on the otters. And so we're very proud to play a role in raising money and being a partner with the park. And there's some of the debris coming out of Shabasquea. Our most current project is the Schultz's Trail cleanup. The railroad provides access. In fact, it's one of the few access to some of the wilderness back areas. And many years ago, there was a portage that was basically filled with debris. You see a little bit of that over in the left corner. We just raised $9,000. And again, we're paying for flights to haul the debris out. We're also recruiting a very small number of volunteers to help the park staff gather that debris and put it on an otter and fly it out. So hopefully the next time you get off the train at Schultz's Landing, it'll look a lot better than it does right now. Some other encouraging partnerships. Again, our membership, I think, is a good example of that. We stand at 362, 181 are Canadians, 171 are Yanks. We crossed 5 time zones, 3 continents. We got 1 Swiss, and then we got 10 folks that we can't identify where they're from. So we don't know if they're from North America, Europe, or whatever, because they didn't give us an address. But it's an equally divided organization between North America, and we're proud to be a partner with our Canadian partners. Promote the wilderness area. We have a display. We're doing an incredible number of shows this year. We're going to be in Toronto. This is some of our work that we've done before. We're going to be in Canoe in Madison, Wisconsin in March. We're also going to be at the Quiet Quiet Symposium in Lansing, Michigan. And we were just at Hamilton. So we're trying to make some of the local shows and tell the story. As noted, our annual meeting will actually be in Madison, Wisconsin. We bought a new display so that we can tell that story a little better. And we partner with Bruce Heyer, who's one of the outfitters up there, and this will be at the Toronto show, so that we can tell our story, but also work with Bruce to get people out there. What do we got here? Oh, promote as a premier wilderness area. Again, as noted, just gives you a sense of some of the shows that we've been to. We're actually going to be in Ottawa on August 26th, which seems to me a little late to be talking about paddling because people will already plan their trips. We have another webinar coming up on February 23rd. Get one of our partners, Ontario Nature. So we're going to be partnering with them to tell that story. Electronic media. Probably one of the most important things that we do is work with maps. That's the Wabakimi project did a lot of work to create a planning map, and we're very proud of that. We've done some updates on that. We actually printed in Saskatchewan, which I think is interesting. We used to produce our own booklets. We had volumes 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll rattle through these rather quickly that cover different regions of the area. Our challenge has been that we just can't keep these up to date, and so what these will come to an end. If you got one, you've got something that's not going to be there any longer, because we built a partner with Lawrence Mills, who has started his own business, WabakimiMaps.com, and Lawrence does a much better job of keeping things up to date. And so basically we partner with him. His maps are going to replace our maps. This gives you just a few of the titles of some of the areas that his routes go through. And I'll note that the photograph is one of the winners from our photography contest. This is the last sister in the Seven Sisters of the Kopka River, which if you haven't done, I was very fortunate to do that last June, and it's really once in a lifetime experience. It's an incredible river. So this is what the very end of it looks like. So I encourage you to buy that map and go do that trip. And so we also work with Lawrence to create a canoe guide for the region, because if you've never been up there, there's a lot of steps to have to get through to figure out how to plan a trip there. It's not the easiest place to plan a trip because you can't just drive your car to the access point and get out. I'll also note this is another one of our award-winning photographs from our photo contest, but Lawrence did the work on this and created this, and we make this guidebook available to help people plan trips to this unique area. And finally, that kind of brings me into the project that we're working on right now. One of our objectives is to develop awareness, understanding, appreciation. There was grant money available. One of our board members was an accomplished grant writer, and he wrote a grant to get us a 3-year grant for the Wabakimi Boreal Caribou Citizen Monitoring Program. It's sort of kind of the Wabakimi Project step 2, because it involves the public, gets the volunteers engaged. And we were very fortunate with that money. We were able to hire Kate Prince. She works for us as the program manager. Again, it's a 3-year project, and she's going to go into more detail on this, but it's funded by the Species at Risk Stewardship Program. And the grant is administered by the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, which I believe, Kate, we have a meeting with them tomorrow, if I remember right. So with that, I want to get out of the way and let Kate tell the real story here. So I'm going to do an exit, and I'll let Kate take over. And so work with me here, Tom, so we make the transition.
Okay.
I'm going to start with a video that shares the project experience from some volunteers last summer. So let's see if I can get that video to start.
This is a great video. It's like I tell Kate, I start crying every time I watch it.
I should have I should have sound going, but please someone just let me know if for some reason sound doesn't work. It'll take just a moment to kick in here.
Looks good and sounds good.
There's something very special about this place, and it really does almost draw you to come back and spend longer.
Myriad waterway routes in the Boreal forest. Very wild. An area larger than Quetico and the Boundary Waters put together that sees only a small fraction of the amount of visitors that those areas do.
I just thought I can contribute to this. Let's go.
People always ask me, well, why do you do that? It's hard work and stuff like that. And, you know, it's just, there's something satisfying about it. And the things that you see, the beauty that's out there. And it's a challenge. You know, there's no doubt that that's part of it too.
That whole learning process of putting the training into action was just really personally satisfying.
I think it's really nice to connect with other people who care about these things, right? And who like going out canoeing as well.
We had never been on a group trip like this ever before in our life. To be able to be out there and experiencing that together with others who have a very similar or interest and passion for that, not only the project, but just that experience and being out there, those are moments that really stay with you.
You're pretty likely to meet some great people.
I've always, you know, explored different places. This weird had a purpose. Do get into the bush a little bit and wander around. You know, if you pay attention, you know, there's things out there. But yeah, you gotta sometimes get off the trail a little bit.
There's something about just being in the habitat, the territory of these creatures. Somewhere where a caribou had her calf, like, you know, that's pretty cool just to imagine them actually there. And like feeling so lucky that we share the earth with them.
Ray and I, bushwhacking.
We did find evidence in a couple different spots. It was like, okay, I can see this perfect. It was more open and mossy, and the lichens were everywhere. You learn, and you think outside the box a little bit. So.
Could very well be. Could very well be.
You learned how to really look more closely at the terrain, and to me it's always a joy to start to see new things. It was an unusual amount of delight to find scat.
Black flies, the mosquitoes, the challenges of the actual groundwork, and camping, dealing with rain, storms, wind, all those things.
You could not only feel like there was something very practical and tangible and a purpose of the trip, you know, you could become more immersed in the whole boreal forest wilderness. You know, oftentimes you're just in awe of just the vastness of it, but then to really focus in when you're, you know, head down looking for caribou scat or pellets, and the excitement of seeing something like that and realizing, wow, there's not only evidence here, but you just feel, I guess, a greater sense of you know, in touch with part of the landscape and part of the wildlife, and specifically the caribou.
I love seeing new areas, new lakes, new routes that I haven't been on. And in this case, of course, it's caribou habitat.
To experience and witness a caribou for the very first time in our lives, yeah, you know, the excitement, the fumbling around, and try to figure out how to zoom in and all of this. Meanwhile, my partner, she's in the front of the canoe holding on to a branch and just kind of freaking out. She's so excited she can't contain her excitement, and yeah, they're just swimming, motoring across the front of us.
If you want something different and want to feel like you're helping the planet or the caribou, there's no doubt that this is worth it for me. I mean, I can attest to that.
That gives you a little taste of what the experience was like for some folks last summer, and also just a little sense of the landscape if you're not familiar with the Wabakimi area. So again, my name is Kate Prince. I'm the project manager for the project. I'm pleased to be able to share a bit more information with you tonight. I see some familiar names out there, and I know some of you have applied to volunteer this summer. So thanks for joining us. It's great to see all of you out with us today. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background about the project, as well as about caribou and about caribou conservation, why it is that we're taking on this project, what are some of the challenges, and then of course I'll fill you in on more about the project itself and how you might get involved if you're interested. So what is the project? It's a 3-year project to survey and document evidence of caribou in the Wabakimi area. The goals are to empower and train wilderness paddlers to gather evidence of boreal caribou present in the area. That means we're recruiting volunteers to go on canoe trips to search for and document evidence of caribou in the area. The data that we collect is submitted to policymakers and available to conservation professionals to inform and hopefully guide caribou recovery efforts. And then finally, there's an important piece of it is an education aspect. We're building interest and awareness of caribou conservation and citizen science. So go to the very basics. What are boreal caribou? Well, sorry, I lost my screen there for a second. When you think of caribou, many people picture the big herds of migratory caribou in the far north. Probably some of you have been so lucky to encounter the porcupine caribou herd or the George River herd in northern Quebec. Probably on canoe trips, which would be pretty nice. To start with the basics, caribou are a medium-sized ungulate, of course, a member of the deer family. They're found throughout the circumpolar north. So, you know, of reindeer in Northern Europe and Russia, these are the same species. The subspecies that we're looking at is woodland caribou, which are located within the green range on the map here, nearly from coast to coast in Canada. And then an even further distinction, which brings us to boreal caribou, is the ecotype breakdown. So in Ontario, the non-migratory forest-dwelling caribou are within that central band in Northern Ontario. Those are the boreal caribou we're talking about. Caribou are exceptionally well adapted to life in the boreal forest. If you've ever seen a caribou swimming, you'll have noticed that they really float quite high on the water, or you might have picked that up in the video. Their backs almost sit along the surface of the water, and that's because they have hollow hair that gives them excellent buoyancy, perfect for the boreal forest, lakes and rivers of the north, and this hollow fur also traps air, both within their coat and also inside the individual hairs, which creates exceptional insulation for the cold winter climates. They're also, of course, adapted for walking on soft ground, like peatlands in the north and in deep snow with large rounded hooves that act like snowshoes. They also use those hooves to dig for lichen in the snow. It does remain their preferred food source throughout the year, although they do eat other things as well. They're not the large herd animals of the far north. As I mentioned earlier, they do remain relatively solitary in small groups, typically of under 15 animals in the winter, and they tend to be even more solitary in the summer months. They thrive in mature boreal forest that's rich in lichens, peatlands, muskeg, and despite their low density, they require very large tracts of this mature forest to support the population. The large tracts of forest allow caribou to disperse across their range successfully, even when conditions are unfavorable in one area, such as when there's a disturbance caused by natural means like fire, blowdowns, insect damage, or human disturbance like forestry or mining activity. It also allows them to spread out to avoid predators and move to appropriate habitat during different times of year and different life cycle seasons, like during calving season, for example. In terms of predation, caribou become more vulnerable to predators when they're sharing their habitat with other prey animals, like moose that attract those predators. Moose thrive in younger regenerating forests, and so you can picture the situation where forestry occurs in caribou habitat in that mature forest. The area begins to regenerate, more moose will move into the area, which attracts more wolves, and then that increases the chance of encounters between caribou and wolves as well. Caribou calving season is spring, early summer, May and June. During calving season, the pregnant females will travel solo to remote areas, usually islands, peninsulas, sometimes wetlands, to give birth in late spring and early summer. And then the cow and calf will stay in that area because it's relatively safe as the calf grows over the summer months. One of the project's goals is to focus on identifying calving areas. And the reason for this is that caribou are known to use the same calving areas, either groups of islands or even one island in particular for many, many years. So identifying and protecting historic calving grounds is important, as these are places where caribou will return to seek safety for calving year after year. Caribou have a low rate of reproduction. Unlike moose or deer, the rate of giving birth to twins is extremely low. So once a female reaches reproductive age, which is 3 years, they are only raising one calf a year. So why caribou? Why have we taken on this project? Well, boreal caribou are listed as threatened both provincially and federally. since 2003 and 2008. Threatened status means that the population numbers have decreased to a size that they'll continue to decline until some sort of action is taken to reduce the threats to the population. They're not self-sustaining. Historically, caribou ranged as far south as Algonquin Park in Ontario, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, even into New York and Vermont, and their range has been reduced by 40 to 50% in Ontario since the 1800s. The most significant threat to the caribou population in the Wabakimi area continues to be habitat disturbance due to resource extraction, logging, mining, road building, and on top of that, as I mentioned earlier, the increased predation that's caused because of that changing habitat. Caribou are able to withstand a certain level of disturbance within their range. At this point in time, few of Ontario's caribou ranges are considered self-sustaining, and they're likely to continue to decline without some sort of intervention to change that habitat disturbance. Then finally, something that I like to think about in terms of the value of protecting caribou is they're called an umbrella species, meaning that protecting them results in overall improved health of the entire boreal forest ecosystem. And this is a quote from Environment and Climate Change Canada that really sort of sums up that sentiment. Protection of the boreal caribou's critical habitat is expected to improve outcomes for 80 other listed species at risk, benefit 90% of the bird and mammal species that live in the boreal forest, and provide protection of soil carbon hotspots. So protecting caribou habitat benefits other threatened species like wolverine, many boreal breeding songbirds, because it just means that we're creating and protecting intact, healthy ecosystems for those species as well. And of course, the benefits go beyond species at risk. It also means limiting climate impacts by keeping those massive carbon sinks in the north intact in the boreal ecosystem. And of course, I'll point out that what's good for caribou is also good for paddlers. It's the thing that brings us into contact with caribou, if we're lucky, which is those large tracts of undisturbed wilderness and the healthy ecosystems and wildlife that we seek out that come with those things. So I know Vern put us on the map, but there you go. There's the dot in the middle is showing Wabakimi Provincial Park. And then this horseshoe around the outside is the area that the project is targeting. So most of our surveys will take place on Crown land areas outside of the provincial park itself. And briefly, I want to put this in context of how caribou are being managed more broadly. So across Canada, the boreal caribou population is divided up into 51 ranges. This is for the purpose of more tailored management and assessment, so that the different ranges can be assessed that face different challenges or different degrees of threat in different places. Caribou experts and scientists have determined that in order for a caribou population to have a 60% chance of being self-sustaining, the population range needs to have less than 35% of it that is disturbed. So when you zoom in on Ontario here, these are the ranges where we're working. The Bright Sand and Nipigon ranges within the orange circle. So I'm going to zoom in on those. And there's a lot going on here. I'm going to explain what you're looking at. Don't worry too much about reading anything. The maps here show those two ranges. So the Bright Sand range is on the left and the Nipigon range on the right. These maps come from a Government of Ontario report from 6 years ago that assessed the state of the caribou ranges in the province. So picture that these, of course, are one contiguous area. These go back together. The dark blue is water the most obvious feature being down here on the Nipigon Range. This is Lake Nipigon. The light blue is areas of human-made disturbance, and the red is natural disturbance, which would often be fire activity. Now, Wabakimi Park is not marked on the map, but it's located mostly within this northern area of the Bright Sand Range. And I'll just point out a few of the lakes for those of you who are familiar with the park. So we've got Wabakimi Lake, Whitewater Lake, and White Clay. So if you imagine the main body of the park sort of surrounds that area there, you can see how there's much less disturbance within that protected area. And then you can picture how, as caribou venture outside of the park, they face a pretty significant threat. And then finally, you remember the number of 35% disturbance threshold. Unfortunately, the Bright Sand Range is assessed at a disturbance of 43.5% and the Nipigon Range at 39.3%. So in both areas, the caribou population is under pretty significant pressure from habitat disturbance. So where does our data go? The data we collect is submitted annually to Ontario's Natural Heritage Information Centre, the branch of the MNR that's responsible for maintaining provincial records of species at risk. And then the NHIC can share that information in the database to support conservation and forest management planning across Ontario. And the data, our database will also be made available to conservation professionals to help guide the protection of boreal caribou. And it allows the Friends of Wabakimi to make informed comments backed by recent data during the forest management planning process in the managed forests within the area. So this is the second year of the project, but to give you a very brief summary of what we accomplished last year in our startup test year, I'll give you the 10-second summary, and if you're interested in diving deeper, you can check out the reports on the FOW website. So in 2024, we conducted 3 surveys to 3 different survey lakes. 13 people participated, and in total, we conducted 82 survey points. Our teams found evidence of caribou at 21 survey points. So this graph shows the number of sites where the evidence was found, not the actual quantity of that evidence. The most common evidence we found was pellets or scat, found at 2/3 of the sites. We also found tracks, bedding areas, and some very fortunate surveyors observed 3 individual caribou at 2 of the different sites. And so that brings us to year 2 this year. So this summer, we plan to conduct at least 6 survey trips, which will involve 24 to 30 volunteers approximately. We will be focusing on a new set of target areas that will be located again outside the park on Crown land and accessed from the Armstrong area. And we'll continue to promote the use of iNaturalist for paddlers not involved in our survey trips to report evidence of caribou they find on their own personal trips. The main focus of the survey trips, of course, is to search for and document evidence of caribou. The trips take place in July and August, specifically because in that time we're able to avoid disturbing the cow and calf caribou that could be in their bedding areas still at a time when they're most sensitive. Trips will be composed of 4 to 6 people who are given a target lake, and then those individuals take on the planning of the canoe trip themselves, all the logistics of how they'll access the area and those details. The survey sites are chosen based on habitat characteristics and geographic locations that are caribou's preferred habitat, so islands, peninsulas, and beaches for the most part. And finally, We do have a science advisory board. Volunteers are receiving training to carry out the surveys following the standardized protocol that's been designed by our science advisory board. So the survey protocol itself is very straightforward. To conduct a survey, volunteers begin by paddling around an island or along the shore of a peninsula in order to find a suitable landing that provides easy access for caribou, such as a beach or a low, unobstructed path. And typically that also means it's a reasonable place to land a canoe. And then the search begins. So once on land, surveyors document their location using a GPS and then head off to walk either around the perimeter of the island or kind of around the edges of the peninsula looking for evidence of caribou. And so what exactly are we looking for? Well, it's not the most glamorous of the findings, but pellets or scat are the most abundant type of evidence that we find. In the first year of the season last year, 2/3 of the sites with evidence of caribou had pellets. So you can see the ruler in the top left photo. We can determine whether the pellets are from an adult, a yearling, or a calf caribou using the size. And then we can also determine how old they are by looking at how dry or wet they are, whether they're beginning to decompose or are very fresh. Another piece of evidence we look for is bedding areas. So the bedding areas often have other evidence as well, pellets, evidence of lichen, forage, caribou hair. The bottom two photos there are, you can see that sort of white straw-like stuff, that's caribou hair. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we'll find the female shed antler. But yeah, a little bit of caribou behavior. After the female caribou gives birth, the first task of that newborn calf is to gain enough strength to move around and learn how to swim. And so the cow and calf will move around between different bedding areas within a week or 10 days of the calf being born, and typically they'll stay within a relatively small geographic area, but this gives them greater safety once they can move around. I'm going to play another short little video that just gives you a bit of a sense of what a survey looks like and also what a bedding area looks like. Here we've got a bed where a caribou has laid down. You can see it's packed down, trampled down there, and there's some traces of fur left behind.
The other thing we get at this site here is a nice view of the water. So if the mama caribou is surveying its surroundings, it's got a nice view of everything coming here from the water side.
So here we have adult winter pellets. They're sort of worked into the moss and lichen, partially covered by leaves, and they're quite dry. You'll notice in that video that in those more upland areas, the ground is typically covered in moss and lichen, so detecting tracks can be extremely difficult, nearly impossible. Tracks are most often visible on beaches, both because the caribou like beaches and because they're just easier to identify in wet sand than in the moss. So this is also a priority stop for our surveys. Caribou have some amazing adaptations around their antlers. One compelling example of how deeply intertwined the caribou are with their habitat is the growth of their antlers. Male caribou begin growing their antlers in March. They grow quite quickly throughout the spring and early summer, and they're completely hardened by mid-September. And then after the rut in November, when they no longer need them, they will shed their antlers in the early winter and spend the rest of the winter without. Female caribou develop smaller antlers. From June to September, pregnant females will keep the antlers throughout the winter and use them to defend food sources that are critical to them during their pregnancy. And then a pregnant female will lose her antlers within days after calving, it's triggered by a hormone change. So that's the reason why we look for those antler sheds. It's a clue that we might be looking at a bedding area. Females who are not pregnant will lose their antlers earlier in the winter, which means that the only caribou with antlers through the bulk of the winter months are the pregnant females. And so they have this advantage over other caribou to defend that critical food source. We didn't find any antlers last summer, but it's something we'll continue to look for. And then, of course, the last piece of evidence, what we're all hoping for is to be lucky enough to actually spot some caribou. So another piece of our project is promoting the use of iNaturalist for reporting caribou sightings. You don't need to be on one of our survey trips for your sightings to be valuable. In addition to the on-the-ground surveys, we're asking folks to report their sightings to both our project, the FOW project at the top, and the NHIC's Rare Species of Ontario project. This will make sure that the record gets into the official provincial database. These are just a few of the observations that have been made so far to our project. And if you're not familiar with iNaturalist, I would challenge you to make an account and just start by making a few observations around your house or around town. You don't have to know what you're looking at, which is a great thing. It doesn't have to be a rare species for it to be a really valuable observation. And then, of course, if you're knowledgeable about something in particular, which I expect many of you are, you can add to the data by identifying other people's observations as well. So before I wrap up, I just want to point out that, as is the case with many conservation issues, caribou conservation is not only about having the right data to guide decision making. It's also heavily affected by policy, and it can be extremely difficult to make policy changes, especially when there's economics and jobs that people at least perceive are going to be impacted. There's many organizations, both in Canada and the United States, that are working for caribou conservation by tackling different aspects of the issue through research, education, and lots of advocacy. And so I would strongly encourage you to look up these organizations, learn more about what they're doing as well, and find out about how you can be involved or support the work that they're doing. The Friends of Wabakimi website's up there at the top. I would also encourage you to have a look at that for more information about the project, or you can get in touch with me if you have any questions. At this point, we've had an overwhelming response to our invitation for applications. We do have a few spots that we may still be filling, but many of the spots have filled for this year. we are looking to line up a few people who might be able to fill in if we need a backup, if we have a last minute change. But then, of course, this is year 2 of 3. We've got a full summer of trips planned for next year as well. So if it's something you're interested in, I would be happy to chat more and hear from you, and we could talk about what might be a good fit for you in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions.
Great. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Vern. Those were extremely informative and interesting presentations. Terrific. Maybe I'll kick off the questions. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, good. You mentioned disturbances and you mentioned the policy framework and so on. I'm just wondering from both of you what your assessment is of the tug of war between continuing extension of disturbances in the broader area from whatever it might be versus governmental initiatives to protect land. There's the 30% target by 2030 and so on. So I know there are areas that are open for advocacy and so on. Can you just give us a sense of the state of play in terms of protection versus encroachment of disturbances?
Oh my. Well, yeah, there's still active logging going on. Part of the premise is it's being done with the idea that they're creating caribou habitat and that there will always be a mosaic of caribou habitat mixed with the logging. There is controversy as to whether that is actually a functional pattern. The Friends of Wabakimi have advocated setting aside several what we consider somewhat critical areas as conservation reserves, which would still allow the hunting and fishing and access for paddlers, but would stop the logging and the mining. So we're on record of proposing that additional areas be set aside and protected. Whether that's enough is still open for discussion, but there's still a lot of activity taking place in the Crown lands surrounding the protected areas. And as Kate mentioned, the amount of disturbance is reaching that critical level, and Kate can probably dive into more detail on that. So we've stated our position. We're still advocating, and we're hoping that we want to show people what's there and to give them a sense of why this is important. And that's kind of why the project is taking place. One of the questions is, does the ministry do aerial? I believe they do. I'm not enough of an expert to tell you how regular that is. I know the park has done some aerial surveys, and I don't have that information right at my fingertips.
I know, I can tell you the park does flies a transect survey every year, and over the last 2 years, they've had pretty successful surveys. I mean, 2 years obviously doesn't give a trend, but I think my understanding from the park naturalist is that the conclusion is that within Wabakimi Provincial Park, they're doing okay. They're sort of holding their own, but it's that idea that protected area is with less disturbance there is what's sort of allowing them to thrive there, and that's what we need to consider in other areas if we want them to continue to thrive across a much broader area too.
If people have questions, you can maybe take off the screen sharing, and that way if someone wants to make a comment or question, they can put up their hand. So feel free to raise your hand if you've got a question or chime in. I think the muting is off. I'll just ask another one. Obviously the tripping survey activities in the summer. Is there any monitoring in the winter? Is that possible, or is that the aerial surveying?
Yeah, so part of our project does include funding for one winter aerial survey. Again, one winter survey doesn't give you a trend, but what we're doing is we're working with the park naturalist biologist Shannon Walsh to find out kind of what piece is missing. She has she flies the same transect every year to get that kind of repeated data. And so we're working with her to determine where is the best place to kind of help feed into the information that's gathered within the area. Where is it missing? And so that'll be next winter that we'll work on that piece of our project.
Now, if people are doing a trip in Wabakimi on their own, can they take observations and feed them into the project, or do you have protocols and particular standards that need to be met?
Yeah, that's where we would direct you to report it using iNaturalist, as opposed to adding specifically to. We're sort of keeping the two things separate, I guess, because we're looking at trying to get coverage of particular lakes, where any sort of separate observations are very valuable, but we would direct you to iNaturalist to report that.
Which, as you say, is a great idea for everybody out in the wilderness or even in the urban settings. Larry?
It really broadens the scope of the data collection. You know, I met people in Wabakimi who were coming and going from a trip last summer just at an access point, and they said, "Oh yeah, we saw caribou," and I said, "Report it to iNaturalist." And you know, people are out there and people are seeing them, and so that's a valuable way to get some of that information.
Larry?
Yeah, hi. I've been following with Tom some trends, disturbing trends from the Ontario power generation side. Very innocuous little document. If you get into their OPG website and you look a little bit deeper, you'll find a small PDF, very, very colorful document that describes potential damming of 22 additional Northern Ontario sites. Have you folks stumbled across that document? And when we did raise it with OPG, they said it's simply a hypothetical position paper, co-sponsored by the Electrical Generation IEDO Authority, I believe. But OPG said it wasn't necessarily real, but there were a couple of rivers that actually had already gone through the planning phases. I know that the Attawapiskat, the Albany, and others have been described as having potential for hydro generation. Any comments?
It's not a topic that we've driven into, so thank you for bringing it to our attention. I'm sure that some of our members are aware of it, but it isn't something we've taken a position on.
I guess it's as you say, Larry, the Albany, which is downstream from Wabakimi, and the Jackfish River, which is the other side of Lake Nipigon, I think.
That is correct.
Yeah.
The Albany actually is the northern, by our definition, is the northern boundary of the Wabakimi area. And it is dammed up to the north and west of the park.
Mark, yes. Oh,
sorry, just one more quick question. Is there any opportunity for further expansion of the park, even in smaller modules or increments in the near future?
Well, again, we have proposed adding what we thought was considered critical habitat, either as a conservation reserve. I guess it could be also added to the park. I have not heard any proposals from my discussions with park staff of that being a proposal. It certainly wouldn't be a bad thing as far as protecting in the caribou habitat, but I'm not aware of any long range planning to do that.
It's probably impossible to say especially in a sort of a shorter term trend, but I'm just wondering if you're anticipating or even starting to see signs of climate change having an impact on the range of whether it's caribou or other varieties, species in the habitat, or impacts such as changing season, changing precipitation.
Well, you know, it's interesting, and Kate can probably address this. I was on a call that she made a presentation to the Thunder Bay Naturalist organization, and one of the things that came out of that was sighting of skunks. A couple of sightings of skunks within the park, and I believe one of the park staff even mentioned finding blue-spotted salamander, which I think would put that particular species at the far northern and western extent of its range. So those are just two quick examples from a call last night that indicated that there might be some changes and creatures showing up where they've not been before. Kate, you want to add to that, please?
Yeah, the other thing I would add is the last few years, well, quite a few years now, but as paddlers, probably many of us have encountered the impacts of fire, and that would be something that will likely impact caribou habitat. And those fires in some years, in some places, have been more and more devastating, and dramatic swings in. I wouldn't say, I can't give any statistics in terms of impacts on caribou habitat, but that's the one thing I've read pointed to as likely to be a natural disturbance that's going to be fed by climate change and impact caribou in the long run.
Just to Vern's point about some sightings that are unusual, that's a very good case for using iNaturalist, even casually.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you put in a sighting, it may seem sort of mundane or something, but when you have thousands of those or hundreds or however many, some of the oddities will stand out and people can interpret them accordingly.
Yeah.
Vern, is there any competition with regard to outdoor enthusiasts relative to their preference for moose over caribou? Does it cause any conflict relative to the natural distribution?
I don't think there's with recreational use. I know that from a hunting standpoint, a moose is the preferred creature. Obviously, one moose can feed a large number of people, and so I think there's a preference for creating habitat that will provide home for moose because they're a species of choice as far as hunting. And again, there are restrictions put on hunting caribou. So I've heard that in some of my discussions that, if I have a choice, I'd rather have habitat for moose than for caribou because I can hunt the moose.
I'll also point out that for White Sand First Nation in particular, which is the community that's sort of right part of Armstrong, for White Sand, there isn't a long history of or any history really that I've been able to glean of hunting caribou, that the cultural connection is with moose.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? I'm wondering if anybody on the call has spent time in Wabakimi and just wants to provide any observations about their experiences there. It's certainly an appealing area from your videos and description.
It's a wild place. Could I just make a quick comment about my motivation for being involved in this? I'm obviously a long ways away, but Kate kind of made reference to the fact that if you create habitat for caribou, you provide habitat for a lot of other creatures. And I spent my career in Iowa trying to create green belts and connecting the dots of habitat. And so every spring that we have this massive migration of birds that come through the upper Midwest using some of the areas that I helped create, and they go up to the Wabakimi area to breed, and then obviously they come back through. And so I've had people ask, why do you really care? And I go, well, all those birds that I see in the spring and the fall, that's where they go to breed. And we claim them as our birds when they're here, but the reality is that they need those big boreal forests for the habitat, primarily the insects, for their breeding. And so that's sort of my stake in the game, is that those birds go up there to nest, but I get to see them when they come both ways. But as Kate has pointed out, if you protect the caribou, you provide important habitat for a much wider range of species. And so I think it's an important point to make, and also a justification for protecting that caribou habitat.
I think there's reference to having some bird song monitoring in Wabakimi, and I'm just wondering if you have kind of equivalent project on eBird to track the varieties you see coming through there, or seasonally or year round.
Well, we as an organization haven't identified that as a specific project. I know we tried to work real closely with the park naturalists to put those monitors out so that can enhance the work that she's done. And the other thing we have done is sponsor a couple of trips where we got part of the Ontario Bird Atlas. As you know, the idea is to go to these blocks of habitat, and some of these blocks are so remote that nobody's been there. And so we've tried to be involved with working with ornithologists to actually get them into the area so that they can monitor some of these blocks that have never had.
I think Mark or Cheryl, as the case may be, has a question or comment.
Just wondering about what the status of the forest industry is up there. Like, what's the wood flow out of that area, and are the mills viable? Do they seem to be viable long term? We've had so many mills close in Ontario in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I gotta be careful. I'm not sure I can get too deep into that. I just know that there's a lot of pulp coming through Thunder Bay. There's a lot of traffic bringing material down 527 and 599 and into the Thunder Bay operation. I mean, there's a huge pile of pulp there. So whether that's viable in the long run, I can't speak to that, but there's certainly an industry in play right now.
Is it an active effort to intervene in forest management plans in terms of the protection for ecological values or recreational ones?
Do we have plans?
No. Just in terms as interveners in forest management plans that others have for surrounding areas. Is that something that you are an intervener in? Can you?
Well, we actually had a seat on the LCC for the Wabatadong Nuping Forest, which formerly was the Armstrong Forest, which is the area around Armstrong, and we voiced our opinion. Again, there are 5 forest management units in the Wabakimi area, and so we were actively involved in one of them. And I gotta be honest with you, it was a frustrating process because the planning process really isn't designed to look at setting aside conservation reserves. It's really looking at how you go about doing the logging and staying within all the parameters, the setback distances from waterways and portages, and it certainly does that. But it really isn't designed to look at the question, should some of these areas, should the higher use of these areas be for protected areas for wildlife versus for logging and mining? And so the logging proceeds as we speak.
I think one of our participants has highlighted this on other occasions, that these guidelines are interpreted fairly inconsistently across Ontario. It seems to be open season and dependent on the operators, and that there was supposedly going to be a review of the guidelines that apply to, I don't know whether it's cultural or recreational values. So we were trying to keep an eye on that, but I haven't heard any news of that recently. But apparently, inconsistency is the hallmark of how those values are sort of recognized and treated in different areas.
My experience isn't beyond. I don't have much experience in some of these other units, so I really can't speak to that. I think there's good people doing the work that the way the law is set out. My frustration was when it was all said and done, the process wasn't protecting the caribou. And I just saw that as a failure. I mean, there's a process set up, but that's not a piece that's included in it. So there has to be something above and beyond that forest management process if we're going to protect this suite of wildlife that lives in the boreal forest. I mean, it did a pretty good job of protecting waterways. I mean, those are identified, the set-asides are put in place. And so you can paddle through the area and have no idea of what's happening just on the other side of the ridge line. But it doesn't solve that question of protecting critical habitat.
On another side, Vern, is it Wendell Beckwith?
Yeah, the cabin. Yeah.
Is there any plans to restore the cabins, or
well, that came up in the call last night, and the park is kind of unique. It's been there, whatever it is, 40 some years, still doesn't have a park management plan. And that's one of the things that's being looked at in the park management plan is, should there be some active restoration, or should the area just be allowed to drop back, disappear into the boreal forest? And so that's kind of you don't really get an answer when you talk to the park staff. I think they're still trying to figure out what to do with that. But it is still there. It is slowly disappearing. If you haven't got there, you probably should do it fairly soon, because at some point in time, that site will kind of just disappear back into the forest. But it's not real clear how the park management plan will address that.
How are the indigenous partners and nations resident in the area participating?
They're actively involved in the forest management process, but I can't speak to all the different units. And Kate can probably go into more detail, because I know she's been trying to reach out to communicate. There's a lot of indigenous communities that surround the area. I know that the Armstrong area has very strong opinions about the logging. I mean, they feel it's to their benefit to be there. I don't know if that's a consistent statement across the region, and I don't want to put Kate on a spot, but I'm reaching the end of my level of expertise. Kate, would you want to try and address that question?
Well, I guess I'll comment that White Sand, the community of White Sand is heavily involved with the forest management in the area. So that's important economically for the community. And so of course that's a legitimate concern and something that we're sensitive to as well. In terms of the Caribou project itself, we don't have active participation by any of the local communities, but we're opening lines of communication and ready to modify our training to get involvement from any of the communities if some of the communities are interested in participating or helping us to drive the project in the coming years in some form. Yeah.
I just want to highlight one of the questions on the chat, practical information about differentiating caribou, moose, elk tracks, etc. Any rules of thumb?
I can't speak to elk, actually, off the top of my head, but caribou tracks compared to moose tracks, I'll say, those are the ones we'd be looking at in the Wabakimi area. Caribou tracks are very round, the two kind of sides of them are, make a very, very almost a circle. Moose tracks are much more elongated. That would be the main difference.
Join one of the outings and you'll become adept at telling the difference, no doubt.
Yeah.
The maps that are available now, Lawrence Mills products on the Friends of Wabakimi website. We've acquired pretty well the whole suite in our planning run up. I must say that they're exceptional products.
Yeah, Lawrence is a hell of a cartographer. He's been there. And the other neat thing, and I throw this open to everybody, if you find an error, which I found one on the Kopka trip, I brought it to Lawrence's attention and he changed his maps. So they're still living maps. Corrections can be made. If you communicate with Lawrence, he'll work with you to do that. And so that's one of the real values of his maps. They're about as current as you can get, and they've got real field testing on it. So it's been a real pleasure to work with Lawrence. He's been great to work with, and I think it's a very high quality product that he offers out there, and it's digitally available. You can pull it off our website, so it's pretty easy to get a hold of.
Question in the chat for just a brief discussion of historical caribou numbers in Ontario.
Kate, I'll throw that at you.
Yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, I don't actually have a historical number. I know the trend is down, is declining. And as Vern said earlier, right now, the number within the park is somewhere around 300 is the estimate. And across Ontario is around 5,000, but I don't actually know. That's a good question, and I'll look into that. This isn't a new issue by any means. Declining caribou populations were raised in that. The issue was raised in scientific literature as early as 1949, and so it's been on people's radar for quite some time, but I don't actually know what, in 1949 or in the 1800s when the habitat area was sort of closer to at its peak, what the number would have been at that time. It's a good question.
But it's in our hands now, so.
That's right.
Well, one more question from Mark.
Oh, just on the population, I think Kate mentioned earlier the range retraction. You don't have to look at too many topo maps to find a caribou lake, and there's certainly a couple of caribou lakes in the Sault Ste. Marie area, and there's accounts of people hunting them just west of the city of Sault Ste. Marie 150 years ago. So whatever the population was, it was pretty significantly larger than it is now because the range was, as Kate said, down into New Brunswick and Maine and Minnesota. So we're good on you folks for monitoring this population, but the trend line is not good.
I'll point you to Nestogan in March, I believe, is going to have an article partly about our project, but partly about just a bit more about caribou conservation and the threats that caribou are facing. And it also includes a little bit more about some of the politics and how the Ontario government came to this point of funding this project and kind of that relationship between the feds and the Ontario government. So you can watch for that in March for a little bit more.
Thank you for that shout out. For those who don't know, Nestogan is the magazine of the Wilderness Canoe Association, and it's great that your work is going to be featured in that. The questions keep coming. Correlation between caribou populations and predation. You've given us some insight on the dynamic works. It sounds like it's a very complex area.
Yes, I think it is. That's certainly been shown that predation, that impact is of increased predation is sort of caused by changing habitat. When the habitat changes, it brings more predators into contact with the caribou and just increases the chance of an encounter.
Yeah, when you create roads, you create lines for predators, and so you just make access a whole lot easier and harder for the caribou to avoid the predators.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Complicated. Anyway,
Yeah.
Let me just bring us to a conclusion now. That was terrific. I think you're doing such important work. I can think of few things more important these days than ecological stewardship. And you've enlightened us all on some of the practicalities and what's at stake, and the fact that, as you emphasize, Vern, and you both emphasize that you protect one animal and it has implications right across the ecosystem and vice versa. So that's a great takeaway from this talk. So thank you so much. Gary, any concluding
Thank you very
remarks?
much for letting share this moment with us. We appreciate the work that you do and the partnership. Thank you.
Great.
Okay.